All right, last premise, there is suffering in our world. What do you think? Is that premise true, false, questionable? That one seems pretty obviously true. Of course there's suffering. There's all sorts of nasty things that both you've experienced and I personally have experienced. So one thing to note, though, now that we've evaluated every other aspect of this argument, the important question now isn't whether there's any suffering at all. The question is whether there's any extra suffering in our world. That is there any suffering that doesn't seem like there's a legit reason for it to be here? Any unjustified suffering? Any unnecessary suffering? Any extra or gratuitous suffering out there? So, just to summarize how we evaluated this logical version of the problem of suffering argument, overall, it seems like there are lots of good things about it. The structure in general seems good. Premises 1 and 2 seem good as well. But premise 3 in particular seems to be a point of contention. Maybe an all-good God has a legitimate reason to allow suffering out there. And furthermore, even if premises 1, 2, and 3 are true, that might not be good enough evidence that God would stop the suffering out there. Even if God wants there to be no suffering in some weaker sense of want, doesn't mean God has no overriding reasons to allow suffering as well. Alright, so this suggests we really need to try to tackle that question: what possible legitimate reason could God have for allowing suffering? What good reason could an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God have for allowing all the suffering in the world? And I think it might be actually easy to justify lots of suffering out there. Just some dumb cases I can think of. I go to the dentist a lot, and when I go to the dentist, I don't know about you, I suffer. I think that's a really bad experience. It's uncomfortable. Sometimes it's downright painful. It's really annoying. It can be stressful. And it seems like, in general, a bad suffering experience. But I feel like I have a really good reason to go to the dentist. That's to prevent even more suffering in the future. I take a little bit of pain and discomfort now for about, 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour when I'm at the dentist to avoid lots of long-term toothaches, long-term pain and problems with my gums and teeth in the future. So that seems like I can justify that short amount of suffering because it helps prevent long-term suffering. Same thing for another way of justifying suffering. Maybe some guilty people deserve to suffer. They deserve, as proper punishment to experience some pain themselves, either removal of their freedoms or maybe even physical pain itself. So I can imagine justifying lots and lots of instances of suffering that way as well. Sometimes also, I know I'm doing something that's really enjoyable, and I know that something bad may result about that, but I feel that my enjoyment I get out of it is worth the potential suffering that results in it. So I happen to really be into tennis. I like playing tennis, and I realize in some sense that I may wind up getting injured one day playing tennis. Maybe I'll, pull a hamstring or twist my ankle or something dumb like that. I know that's a legitimate risk, but even if I do wind up twisting my ankle, say, I still won't think that all that tennis playing I've done throughout my life was stupid and unjustified and awful because of the one bad suffering thing that happened to me. No, I feel like that's just part of the process, that sometimes when I'm doing an enjoyable thing, maybe a negative thing accidentally will come about as a result of it, but still, the enjoyment I get out of that is so much worth the potential suffering there that it justifies it. Alright, so all of that seems to be justified suffering. But there still seems to be a slew of cases of instances of suffering that seem, on the face of it, completely unjustified and maybe even unjustifiable. What about some of those cases we just mentioned? The boy suffering from the plague. The boy who just suffers for days and days on end before finally dying. What possible reason could there be to justify that? What about cancer? The people who just get cancer randomly, not as a result of smoking or drinking or doing anything that's their own fault, but just somebody who gets cancer through what we think of as the normal course of things. What about random car accidents? What possible good reason could there be for all these instances? So this leads us to a second version of the problem of suffering argument. And this is what's sometimes referred to as an evidential version. It seems like no reason is good enough to justify all the suffering in the world. We can come up with lots of good reasons to justify some of the suffering, but it's not clear that we can come up with enough reasons that are good, legitimate, to justify all the suffering. So here's this version of the problem of suffering, our second version. If there is an O3 God, then God has a legitimate reason to allow all the suffering in the world. But premise 2 says there just isn't such a legitimate reason to allow all the suffering in the world. There's no way we can explain why all this suffering is here. So that means, as our conclusion, there is no O3 God. So what do you think about that argument? Now we're not saying that God is literally incompatible with suffering, because God might be compatible with all sorts of suffering out there. Now we're just saying that it doesn't seem like there's going to be a good enough reason to explain each and every instance of suffering on the planet that has happened throughout the history of the planet. So let's evaluate this one step by step. We'll check the structure, then we'll check all the premises. Checking the structure first. Do premise 1 and premise 2 logically lead us to the conclusion? If there's a God, then God has a legit reason. There isn't a legit reason, so there is no God. Good structure? Bad structure? What do you think? Well, this seems to be a classically good structure. It's that same really good if-then conditional style argument. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. We like that structure. All right, so let's turn to premise 1. If there's an O3 God, then that God has a legitimate reason to allow whatever suffering exists in the world. What do you think? Is that a good premise? Premise 1? False premise? Questionable premise? That one seems true as well. It wouldn't seem to make sense for God to just put suffering on the planet, but then have no really good reason to allow that suffering. If God really is an all-good God, a morally fair, just God, it seems like God should have a reason to allow it. Otherwise, God is causing all this unnecessary badness in everyone, and that just seems unjust. That seems immoral. So it seems like God should have a legit reason to allow it, if God allows it at all. So our last premise, premise 2, says there isn't a legitimate reason to allow all the suffering in the world. What do you think? Is that true? Is that false? Is that questionable? Well, this seems to be the one to challenge. And one important thing is that it's not obvious the first time you think about this for lots of people. It's not obvious what possible reason there could be for a boy suffering from the plague. It's not obvious why people get cancer. It's not obvious why hurricanes exist. It's not obvious why people get murdered. So this is the problem that Father Panelo in the Albert Camus reading from The Plague seemed to bump up against. Why would God allow this? What legitimate reason does God have? And Father Panelo fell back on the maxim, well, God has reasons, they're just reasons we can't understand. God works in mysterious ways. But maybe we can come up with a legitimate reason. Maybe we can try to figure out why God would allow all this suffering in the world. So maybe there is a legit reason. So premise 2 says there isn't, but maybe there is. And what I want you to do before you come to class and before you turn to the next lectures is brainstorm for yourself. Try to figure out what possible legitimate reason could there be for a just God to allow every instance of suffering there is in the world. And what we're going to be doing in the next lectures is taking a look at 2 potential legitimate reasons. Free will might be one reason, and soul building might be another. So I'll see you then. Bye-bye.